It's Monday, the 10th of October. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, well, in a moment, we hope, Conservative MP Matt Warman, Shadow Defence Minister Luke Pollard, Scotland Environment Minister Mari McCallan and Professor of Politics at the University of Kent Matthew Goodwin and the Deputy Political Editor of The Spectator Katy Balls. Today, this message to Liz Truss from a former Chancellor.
Her overall objective, which is to encourage growth, is the right one. I'm full square behind that. But I hope lessons have been learned over the last few weeks.
After a chaotic week at conference, the Prime Minister goes on a charm offensive.
Our growth plan has delivered all those promises and more, Mr. Speaker, and I commend it to the House.
The Chancellor's mini-budget last month. Now we only have 3 weeks to wait to find out whether his sums add up. Remember this?
I want to get net migration back to the tens of thousands, which it was in the 1990s.
That was 2014. But is the current Conservative policy to reduce immigration or increase it? And in Scotland, plans to make it easier for someone to change their gender prompt protests. Let's start with the charm offensive being embarked upon by Liz Truss, the Prime Minister. Let's have a look at the headlines. In fact, it's very clear. Truss turns on the charm. Prime Minister plans policy lunches to win over Tory critics. And there's also discussions about whether benefits should be uprated in line with inflation or earnings. Katy Balls, what's it going to consist of beyond the lunches?
I think there's a few aspects to this supposed charm offensive. Ultimately, it comes after a pretty calamitous first month for the Prime Minister. We saw all the division at Tory conference. I think this is an attempt to try and reach out to the parliamentary party. So policy lunches. You also have Liz Truss addressing the 1922 committee this week. That will be on Wednesday. And then I think other reach out, bringing MPs in for, drinks and so forth to try and have that level of contact. And then I think we've also seen a flavour overnight. Now, Conor Burns sacked as a trade minister. In his place, Liz Truss has appointed Greg Hands. Now, this is significant because Greg Hands was a key Rishi Sunak supporter, and one of the big criticisms of Liz Truss early on when she formed her government, when she had that reshuffle, was that she wasn't really reaching across. She was just rewarding loyalty. I think there was even a conversation Sam Coates from Sky reported, which was what Liz Truss allegedly told Grant Shapps, which was, you're a very good performer in the media, you're very good at your job, but you didn't back me, so off you go. And therefore, I think you can look at the Greg Hands appointment. So the first opportunity Liz Truss had to really, bring someone in, whether that was someone who backed her in the leadership or someone who backed Rishi Sunak, as a quiet admission that she does need to change tack if she is to have the party stick with her.
Now, what's your impression of this charm offensive and perhaps a softening in terms of including former supporters of Rishi Sunak, for example?
I think it reflects her weakness very early on. I think one of the ideas in politics is path dependency, that where you start determines where you end up. And Liz Truss's beginning has been very problematic. I guess the question that I've been thinking about over the last few days is what happened back in July and August? Because Truss's team knew they were coming in really in late July when you look at those polls. What happened in August and September? Where was the planning? Where was the preparation? Where was the framing, Jo, of this premiership, this growth strategy? And now it's sort of just come apart and she's lost the narrative. And I don't understand what happened back in July and August that sort of left us here.
Katy?
Yeah. I think it's an interesting one. There was obviously lots of time to work out how you were going to land exactly Liz. I think one of the problems Liz Truss has had is one that previous Prime Ministers have, which is consulting a really small inner circle of advisors. And actually, when you speak to even some in Number 10, they said they did not know about the 45p plan in that not so mini budget. They were taken by surprise by it. And therefore, I think that because things have gone badly so quickly, initially, I think Downing Street was actually almost alarmingly calm after the fallout from the mini-budget. I think there's now been a realisation that actually have to change tack in a few ways, and we're seeing it. There's Greg Hands. I think there's also look at how Downing Street is operating. But then also today, in terms of the Treasury, the fact that they're bringing forward the OBR forecast, and also when it comes to the Treasury Permanent Secretary, lots of concern about the fact Tom Scholar was sacked or asked to leave politely. And now you have a situation where the person who was tipped for it, Antonio Romeo, is no longer the front runner. Instead, they'd like to go some of a Treasury experience. So all these things, I think, are an admission that all the fighting talk early on, which is perhaps encouraged by appealing to the Tory membership, they've realised that does not actually work when you're in government, and it has to be toned down.
I mean, Matt, can you reflect perhaps some of the polling that's been done? This is in The Guardian. Liz Truss approval ratings reach new lows after Tory conference. PM's minus 47 net rating in opinion poll, worse than Boris Johnson's at height of Partygate scandal. And this is within 4 weeks of actually taking the top job.
Well, she's had ratings that are lower than Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, that's saying something. And it's not only this, actually, Jo, it's that I actually polled voters last week and I said, who do you blame for the current problems in the UK? And the plurality of voters blame Liz Truss's government. They don't blame global events. They're not blaming the war in Ukraine. So when I say that the government has lost the narrative, that's what I mean. What they should have done early on is come out of number 10 and say, this is what's happening in the world. This is why we're going for growth. Let me explain it to you. This is why we're doing X, Y, Z. Because they didn't really do any of that, the moment things have come a little bit unstuck, the narrative's imploded. And as Katie says now, they're in this position of weakness where they're having to make all these compromises.
All right, we'll come back to Conservative Party politics in just a moment because, of course, it's the final day of the SNP conference being held in Aberdeen. We'll, of course, be covering Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister's speech, to conference live and uninterrupted. It's coming at about 3:10. We're going to have a special Politics Live programme from 3 until 4. But she did an interview with my colleague Laura Kunsberg yesterday and said this.
Would I prefer a Labour government over a Tory government? I detest the Tories and everything they stand for, so it's not difficult to answer that question.
That was Nicola Sturgeon. Let's welcome Conservative MP Matt Warman, who has arrived. But, Murray, do you detest Matt Warman, the Conservative sitting here in the studio?
No, of course I don't. But look, we have a bedroom tax, a rape clause, benefit sanctions, we have a Home Secretary whose dream is the rendition of asylum seekers to Rwanda. These are pretty abhorrent policies, and you really don't have to go far in Scotland to find people who agree with that view. And if I can just add to that, it's particularly galling for us in Scotland to have lived under these policies, and it is policies that the First Minister was referring to, because we haven't voted for the Tories in 60 years.
Right, but Murray, she said, I detest the Tories and all of their policies or everything that they stand for. She was talking about Tories. Matt, do you detest Murray?
No, I don't. I detest the SNP's record in Scotland on a whole host of issues, but I'd never talk about it in those terms. We have to talk about politics in policy terms, and I think we all have to accept that everyone, whether it's Luke, whether it's me, if for whatever party, goes into this business to try and make the country a better place, and that's not what I think Nicola Sturgeon was saying she believes.
Was that language too strong, Murray?
No, I don't think it is, because the First Minister has clarified that she was talking about policies, and I have just listed just a flavour of what people in this country are currently living under with the haphazard Tory government that, as I say, we haven't voted for in Scotland for 60 years. You know, you talk about policies and everyone trying to make the country a better place. There's people up and down this country right now, parents who are starving themselves so that they can afford to feed their children. That is the direct result, or has been worsened by the policies of this government. So, as I say, they are abhorrent policies, and you won't struggle to find people in Scotland who agree with that view.
Well, Luke, would you use that word and that sort of language, to detest your political opponents like Matt Warman and Murray McCallum?
No, I don't think so. I think it's fine in politics to disagree with someone, but you don't have to be disagreeable. I think over the past few years, we've seen the deliberate ramping up of anger, hate, and that really kind of like nasty rhetoric.
By whom?
Well, I saw it from the government occasionally. We've seen it across the board sometimes. But that doesn't help people. It doesn't help people be included in the political process. It doesn't help people think that politics is a way to get a better Britain, which is really where all parties should be in trying to include those people that are being turned off politics because of the lies, because of the parties, because of the scandals, because of the economic mismanagement. Find ways of including people in our politics, not shunning people from them.
I mean, Angela Rayner, Labour's deputy leader, got into some trouble. In fact, she apologised in the end for calling Tories scum, because in the end, it's also talking about voters, isn't it? People who vote for these parties, whether it be the SNP or the Conservatives.
Yeah, I don't think that language was particularly helpful, and Angela was right to apologise for it. And I think in the heat of a moment, people can say things that they don't mean to say. But when it comes to it, our politics needs to be kinder and better than it is currently, because we need to see a change in the way that government is delivered, and that's not going to happen if we all get our daggers out and stab each other in the face.
Do you think people think that politicians are talking about them when you hear Nicola Sturgeon say, I detest the Tories and everything they stand for, Angela Rayner saying that Tories are scum, Hillary Clinton talking about the deplorables? Or do they realise and take what the First Minister has said is, I'm not talking about individuals here?
I think it just adds to this sense that politics has become much more tribal and a bit more polarised. And I think Nicola Sturgeon, I mean, I wonder how she would respond if Boris Johnson had said something like that about Labour, or Nigel Farage had said something like that about the Greens or whatever. And I think the fact is we are not America. What makes us distinct from many other countries, it used to be argued in the 1950s, was our so-called civic culture. We were polite, we were deferential, we were pretty civilised, we were nice people. And I think actually that's still true of Britain's political culture overall. And that's why it's nice to see everyone, left, right, centre, with the exception of a couple of people, agreeing that actually this language isn't acceptable in British politics, and we shouldn't slide into this America-style polarisation, because, to be frank, I think actually we've got a better tradition than that.
Mari?
Yeah, no, listen, I absolutely agree that as politicians, as people involved in public life, we should always challenge ourselves to conduct our debate as respectfully and with the best information that we possibly can. But whilst that is the case, it does not take away from the fact that people up and down this country are suffering, they are angry. We have lived under 12 years of austerity with this government. We then moved into Brexit, ideologically pursued during the midst of a pandemic. And then, lo and behold, in a cost of living crisis, after a summer of inaction, we see a Tory government whose response is that they propose tax cuts for the rich and public service cuts for the rest of us. It's really no wonder that people are pretty fed up of that.
Well, being fed up is one thing, but should Nicola Sturgeon apologise for using that word and saying, I detest the Tories and everything they stand for?
We shouldn't apologise for pointing out that the SNP is the antithesis of Conservative policy.
Right, but should she apologise for saying, I detest the Tories?
Well, she's clarified that she was talking about the policies, and therefore I think it's perfectly clear to lots of people across Scotland and the UK that as a party, as the SNP, we position ourselves in opposition to the Tories, what they pursue and the effect that has on people up and down the country. But myself, the First Minister, everyone involved in public life, we constantly challenge ourselves to make sure that we bring debate and we bring it robustly, but we do it respectfully. And I think the First Minister has done that.
All right, well, let's go back to what we were talking about before, which is Conservative Party politics. Matt, we started with the headline in the Times, Truss turns on the charm with MPs. Are you charmed? Are you about to be charmed by Liz Truss?
Well, I haven't yet had an invite to one of these lunches or cups of coffee or whatever it might be. I'm sure one will come. Look, I think what we've seen is an attempt to rally the troops behind a Prime Minister who hasn't been in post very long,
not going very well, is it?
Who has set out an agenda. I think ultimately loyalty is better inspired than imposed, right? And so what we need to see is that those changes that she's promised about delivering growth, about making sure that she is able to deliver on the agenda that she set out in the leadership campaign, that's what will make people get behind her.
People like you.
People like me. And I think, look, I want her to succeed because I look at the alternatives and I think they're a heck of a lot worse.
Well, because you're worried about the next election, which is understandable. Can you translate what that actually means, Katie?
Well, not to speak for Matt, but I think effectively we're in a situation where Tory MPs really don't want another leadership contest. I think they will look nothing short of mad or obscene to go through that once again. And therefore, I think begrudgingly, MPs who didn't really back Liz Truss and had concerns would rather stick with her and hope it gets better, at least for now. But that would also involve, in terms of the things that could drive growth, supply-side reform, tricky votes in the House of Commons, which often lead to MPs not wanting to really go for it because they worry about constituent backlash on planning, on the environment. So seeing if that levels out, but then ultimately, I think there is a question, perhaps Matt can answer this, which is, I wonder how long Tory MPs will be comfortable with the polls as they are. Because there's one thing to say, this is a tricky first month, things can turn around. If Labour has a consistent lead of 20 or above, above 30 in some polling, I think that is a really, for a party that's pretty divided as is and worn down, will MPs in 3 months' time tolerate that?
Matt?
Well, I think the answer will be different for every single individual
and
MP.
What is it for you? How long are you going to give her?
There are lots of waymarkers, right, aren't there? There's the forthcoming medium-term plan. There are things like the local elections coming up in May. All of these will be taken by MPs of all parties as proof points of whether this is working. But the thing that matters most is that growth metric. That's what she's set herself as her own target, and that's what I think MPs will be looking at. And that is a longer-term goal. That's what we have to bear in mind.
A different question, not to pick on Matt, but Boston and Skegness, right? Capital of Brexit country. You're elected, 2019 mandate, very different brand of Conservative politics, levelling up the country, lowering immigration, all that sort of stuff. Is there not a philosophical point here that MPs like you are looking at the Truss agenda and thinking, is this the brand of Conservative politics that is actually going to serve Boston and Skegness? Because when you look at it face value, it's a London-centric, financial services-centric model of economic growth. She's not said that much about levelling up. Immigration is going to increase. And I just think philosophically, alongside the point about polling, I wonder if there's a generation of Conservative MPs looking at this and thinking, this is nothing like what I thought I was going to be serving under.
Well, look, I'm not a part of the government. It's not my role to defend it. But what Liz Truss would say, I think, is that broader economic agenda, growing the pie, serves constituents like mine, often with some of the lowest average wages in the country, more than anybody else, because that's what drives growth in public services. So I think this is something that every Conservative MP could get behind, but we've got to see that delivery.
Well, on the subject of growth, let's have a look at this tweet from Mel Stride, who is chair of the Treasury Select Committee. You mentioned the rather catchy medium-term fiscal plan. You may remember, viewers, last week there was some toing and froing about when that might happen, the 23rd of November. Well, you'll be delighted to know it's being brought forward. Having pressed so hard on this, I strongly welcome the decision by Kwasi Kwarteng, the Chancellor, to bring forward the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility UK forecast on the medium-term fiscal plan to the 31st of October. If this lands well with the markets, then the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England meeting on the 3rd of November may result in smaller rise in interest rates, critical to millions of mortgage holders. Are you reassured, Luke?
I'm not reassured because I think the mini-budget is still going to continue in many forms, and that has utterly trashed confidence in our economy.
Yeah, but they're bringing forward the statement now. And the idea is to reassure the markets.
I'm glad they've finally understood that you can't publish massive economic vandalism and self-harm without an independent forecast to show just how much damage it's going to do. And it's good that it is being brought forward.
You don't know what the independent forecast is going to say, do you?
Well, when people are paying £500 more on the mortgage this week compared to the week before the mini-budget, we can see the harm being done in our communities already. So I don't think we need an independent forecast to see the effects of it, but I do want that analysis so we can calm the markets. But I'm afraid I don't think tax cuts for the rich, spending without any idea where it's coming from, and probably more austerity is going to be good for Britain. It's not going to be good for growth, and it's not going to be good for people who are really struggling at the moment.
Murray, do you agree with Mel Stride that you are pleased, you welcome the decision to bring forward this fiscal event, this fiscal statement? It will allow the Office for Budget Responsibility to scrutinise the growth plans by the Liz Truss government and say whether they'll work or not.
Yeah, I think it is a demonstrably good thing that is brought forward and that the Office for Budget Responsibility can be involved this time, because, of course, as your last speaker pointed out, and I agree with him, the mini budget turned out to be a very maxi budget indeed, and a budget which has had an incredibly negative effect. The government gambled They gambled the house, and not their own houses, not their own savings, but the houses and savings of people across the country. So we do welcome any movement from the Chancellor to do what he should have done in the first place and to do it sooner. And we will look very closely at that and decide in the Scottish Parliament what the consequences of it are for us.
Matt?
Well, I absolutely welcome it. I think the more we can do to reassure the markets, the better. The more we can do to make sure that those really painful mortgage increases that the Bank of England might look to are mitigated. All of those are good things. And this is about demonstrating that that agenda that the Prime Minister laid out on the leadership trail is one that will deliver what she offered at the time. And the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. And Luke shakes his head. If it does work out, then that will be exactly what the country needs. But we do have to give it some time.
Right. Well, some time. I mean, obviously, people can debate how long the country has, and voters have. There have been a lot of U-turns, haven't there, within sort of weeks of Liz Truss taking over, whether it be rightly or wrongly on the 45p tax rate, on including now former supporters of Rishi Sunak reaching out, if you like, in the Conservative Party, bringing forward the date of this fiscal event. Are you expecting a call if another post becomes available? Are you...
I mean, look, it is.
Is it that funny?
It is always a privilege to serve. But I think, look, what the Prime Minister has done in the appointment of Greg Hans is, as you say, reach out into a part of the party that felt that it was not in the tent. That is progress for me, and I think it demonstrates that there is space for all flavours of conservatism within her government. That is again progress.
Well, I mean, Matt, we had Greg Hans on the set last week in Birmingham, and he wasn't a minister then. He is now. So maybe this is a sign of a more inclusive government, Luke. Well,
there's only 2 Plymouth Argyle supporters in Parliament, and Greg's the other one compared to me, so I'm glad that he's in there. But look, I mean, how low does the bar have to be? I mean, this looks like a government utterly scraping the bottom of the barrel, desperately moving from one crisis that they've created to another. How much longer do we have to put up with this? How much longer do people have to be able to survive, to keep their homes, to avoid the repossessions, to avoid not being able to feed their family until the government realises, Tory backbenchers realises, that this is broken and we need a general election to sort this out? That's got to be soon.
The problem for the government, I think, is ultimately they've got a few, and they have a few problems right now, but ultimately there's a few measures right now to try and calm MPs. And one of the things is bringing forward the date of this fiscal event. But when it comes to what Kwasi Kwarteng, the Chancellor, needs to do to reassure the markets when it comes to the OBR, that it tends to be what would actually cause political problems for the government. So if Kwasi Kwarteng wants to show that he's going to balance the books and therefore says that, you know, we have these plans to do spending cuts, pretty big spending cuts, that is going to create a political backlash, potentially in the polls, but also with Tory MPs. If he doesn't do that, then you're perhaps not going to calm the markets at all if you can't say how you're going to do this, and therefore you will have a consequence of this. And it's not just the fact this is on Halloween, so the nightmare headlines will write itself if this backfires. It's the fact that you had the Bank of England meeting after. So if this doesn't calm in the way it does, you once again have an event where Liz Truss's government is going to be very closely connected, rightly or wrongly, in terms of what the Bank of England is doing. And we've seen from the polls so far that in terms of the mortgage interest rises we're seeing is being blamed more on the government than other factors. And that's the risk if this goes wrong again.
And that is a risk, Matt, isn't it, when it comes to economic competence?
It's a massive risk. If you know, there are 2 rules in political science. If you lose the image of being economically competent, you're stuffed. And if you're seen as a divided political party, you're stuffed. And the Conservatives seem determined to prove both of those laws to be true. You
mentioned immigration and policies around it, because there are reports, in fact we can have a look at this headline in The Independent. Number 10 sidelines the Home Secretary Suella Braverman in bid to relax immigration rules in fresh cabinet split. Just fill us in a little bit on this story, because we played there in the headlines, Katie, David Cameron saying we want to bring net migration down to tens of thousands. Suella Braverman would like to see that continued, but clearly Liz Truss has other ideas.
Yeah, and I think this all goes back to growth. Ultimately, Liz Truss is betting the house on economic growth. And the various ways she plans to do that, one would be to relax some immigration, not for all, but for specific occupations, that's something that has been discussed in, amongst various ministers. And there are some such as reports, Jacob Rees-Mogg sees the argument of this in certain occupations where there is a shortfall, or they think it's going to help with the growth picture. Suella Braverman, who's of course the Home Secretary, has considerable sway here, is not on the same hymn sheet. And that means that once again, Liz Truss's plans are coming up for resistance, not just against her party, but her cabinet. And this goes to the polls, this goes to the problems in the first month. Liz Truss can say she's happy being unpopular if it leads to growth. The problem is, once you look as though your authority is draining, it's much harder to push measures which are unpopular with your ministers through.
Mari, this is a battle you'd like Liz Truss to win, presumably.
Well, look, yeah, we take a very different view of migration and immigration in Scotland. We want to welcome people to our country. We warmly welcome the economic, social, cultural contribution from people from all over the world, and we want to actively encourage it. And we are bitterly disappointed not to have access to that as part of the European Union anymore, for people to come and live and work in Scotland, and for us to on a reciprocal basis do likewise in the EU. We have tried actually to bring a few suggestions forward ourselves, because we're intent on boosting Scotland's population. We have a rural visa pilot that we're seeking support for right now, but we don't agree with the Tories' position in this, and actually increasingly concerned with Labour's position, because I think that the recent comments from Rachel Reeves about the Tories not deporting enough people, and we find that galling, frankly, and it appears to be that Labour are now trying to out-Tory the Tories on immigration.
Well, Luke, what do you want to say? I mean, you've abandoned free movement. That was stated by Keir Starmer. What exactly is your position in response to Mari?
Well, I think we need to align our immigration system to the skills that are needed much more. That's why we're backing a points-based system. I think where those points go matter. So, for instance, throughout this year and last year, there's been crops rotting in the field because there hasn't been enough seasonal agriculture workers to help pick those crops. We're seeing huge vacancies in our NHS, people unable to get the social care, the nursing needs that they otherwise would do, because those roles aren't included in a proper immigration system. And I think there are still foreign criminals that could be deported faster to make that work. But the problem is our immigration system, if it is divided between a Prime Minister and a Home Secretary that are not on the same page, are not agreeing, I'm afraid it will continue to be businesses and communities that lose out with this hokey-cokey of who's up, who's down here, and a confusion about whether Britain is a welcoming place for people to come to start a career, to invest, and that is not good for our economy.
Before I come to Matt, Mari, do you want to come back on that? You were shaking your head.
Yeah, no, I just reflecting on the fact that, as I said earlier, we've a Home Secretary who dreams of the rendition of asylum seekers to Rwanda, and we've a Labour shadow Chancellor who says we're not deporting enough people. We couldn't be further from that position in Scotland. We value the contribution of people from around the world. We welcome them, and we want to be an independent country back in the EU and able to travel and live and work with the 27 members of the EU again.
I don't think ripping Scotland out of the United Kingdom is going to help the Scottish economy. I don't think it's going to help people in Scotland that are struggling to afford food at the moment. I don't think it's going to improve the pretty poor NHS and education results that we're seeing from a Scottish government. But what we have seen is Labour in Scotland actually delivering some quite big changes. The rent control policy that's now been adopted, that was achieved from opposition. If they can achieve that from opposition, just imagine what Anna Sarwar and his team could do from actually being in government in Scotland. So I think at the moment, the focus needs to be on people who are really struggling, and I get why the SNP have to say that everything's going to be rosier out of the UK. I get that. That's their whole purpose of existence, to trash everything but that policy. I don't think that helps put food on the table, though, for people who are struggling.
Well, Mari, is that correct?
No, it's not correct, Jo. There's challenges in everything in life, and in the SNP we're very clear-eyed about the fact that independence is not a panacea, far from it. But the greatest risk and the greatest challenge of all is going into future challenges without the levers of power to take decisions which reflect the priorities and values of the people you represent. And that's the situation in Scotland just now.
Yes. Sorry, finish your sentence. Sorry. Oh, you ended.
I was finished.
Sorry. That's the problem with down the lines, of course. Yes, come in. Yeah.
What you're seeing in this tussle between Liz Truss and Suella Braverman is an interesting one. It is about that philosophical divide in this new Conservative Party, because on one side are people who are saying, let's basically have a kind of new growth model that is comfortable with large-scale migration. And then there are the other side, Suella Braverman, among others, who are saying, actually, that isn't what Brexit was all about. What Brexit was about was having moderate, ideally lower levels of migration to encourage firms to invest in British workers and train up domestic workers, rather than have this growth model that's completely dependent on cheap migrant labour. And I'm surprised the SNP don't like Boris Johnson's immigration policy, because regarding migration from outside of Europe, it's one of the most liberal migration policies we've had in this country for a very long time.
Well, Matt Warren, but what about your response? Whose side are you on, Suella Braverman's or Liz Truss?
Well, I think what I would like to see is, in some ways, elements of both. One is the migration of people who we need, that shortage occupation list, whether it is doctors and nurses, whether it is to some extent seasonal agricultural workers, all that. But what I think everyone would like to really get on top of is breaking that model that sees thousands of people every year arrive in small boats after making that incredibly perilous journey. And I think what the Home Secretary is talking about primarily is trying to break that model and trying to get over that perennial problem, so that the immigration that we talk about is focused on who is coming here in a controlled and sensible way.
Right, but controlled and sensible way, what Matt Goodwin is raising is the issue of what people were voting for, people in those leave areas when it came to immigration.
Well, I think, as Matt sort of said, that the clue is in that take back control slogan. It is about having the control over who comes and being able to say who isn't able to stay. And that's why I think actually Rachel Reeves is absolutely right to say if you have an ambition to deport people, you've got to be able to get on and do it.
Right, let's go back to this growth model, though. Luke, can we get increased growth, greater GDP, unless there are high levels of immigration when we're a service economy?
I think the answer in all these things is always going to be a mix. So you do need to make sure that you've got a migration system that works. And at the moment, our migration system is not working. Businesses are struggling to get the visas they need for the staff that they want.
So you think we need more
at
immigration, higher levels of immigration?
Well, what we need is a visa system that works for starters. There's no point having lower or higher if the system is broken as it currently is. But what we also need to do is have that proper investment in our own skills. And I'm afraid we're not seeing that corresponding investment in education and skills uplifts that we really need, if that is to be a promise that was delivered. And that's an interpretation of the Brexit referendum. But I'm not seeing the skills investment going into my community in Plymouth. And we wrote, as a community, Plymouth voted leave. Where's the skills pipeline? Where's the money to really change that? What we're seeing is vacancies right across our economy. We're seeing few people out of work. And we're seeing the people who are out of work, either due to mental health or physical health, effectively being derided by government as not contributing to the economy. Now, this is not a narrative that's going to build the better Britain that we need.
I think what you're seeing is Labour trying to position itself so it can win back non-London England. So Labour has not won the popular vote in non-London England since 2001, which is quite remarkable. They've got to win back the working class leavers. But the underlying problem is the growth model problem. How can we get to a new economic model that invests seriously in further education colleges, apprenticeships, technical training, people that were not part of the graduate minority in the cities and the university towns? And my concern with where this Conservative government is going, and especially for seats like Matt's in Boston and Skegness, is I think 2 or 3 years from now, you know, my prediction would be we're running net migration at 350, 400,000 per year. And I'm worried, Joe, that we're going to go back into this big debate over immigration again that we were supposed to have solved with the Brexit referendum and this new migration policy. And I think we're going to end up back where we were in 2014, 2015, where the country's saying, well, why have we got large-scale migration again?
Well, I think the conversation about migration is very different if it is a conversation about uncontrolled, unskilled migration compared to something that fills those vacancies, particularly in public services, that we all see and feel.
Those are popular. Those are popular forms of migration.
And those are very different conversations. So I think you're right to highlight that there is going to be a conversation about immigration. Of course there is, so long as there are those skills gaps. But it will be a different one, and it will be one that is fundamentally based on the control that people in seats like mine voted.
Well, here's another idea in The Sun. The headline says, bonk for Britain. Women should get tax cuts for having children to encourage a baby boom, Cabinet Minister suggests. So, briefing The Sun newspaper that population growth should be achieved through policies to encourage Brits to have more babies. Matt? Good idea?
I'd be interested to know which minister it was that said this,
sure
because
you would.
there isn't a name attached to it. Look, I think the point about do we need to fill some of those vacancies, do we need to sort of think about the population overall, of course that's the right one. This to me seems like a policy that was a bit back of an envelope and a little bit overexcited.
Mari, do you think it's a good idea?
I just think it's another example of the perverse and bewildering things that seem to be coming out of Whitehall right now. You know, it's really interesting to hear one of your commentators very closely link Brexit as being the way to solve the immigration problem. Of course, we didn't see it that way in Scotland, and it's probably partly the reason why we voted overwhelmingly to remain. I said at the top of my answer, we welcome migration into Scotland. We actively want to encourage it because we value the economic, social and cultural value of those who can come to live in Scotland
and
from throughout the world.
Increasing the birth rate in Scotland, would that be a policy that the SNP would get behind?
I think we don't want to see population decline in Scotland, and we recognise that we have demographic challenges with an ageing population, etc. But I'm not sure that statal intervention in people's life in that way is particularly appropriate, nor actually necessary, when we could just, as public officials, focus on building immigration and migration systems that work.
Luke?
As a gay man, bonking for Britain won't make much of a difference to the birth rate for me, but the thing that could make a difference is sorting out childcare. It's making sure that people can afford childcare, because if you want to encourage people to have more children, you've got to be able to have a situation where those children can be looked after and cared for properly. And at the moment, with some families spending over 50% of their income on childcare, there is a perverse disincentive to achieve what that is supposed to be doing. And that's why we need a change here.
And we are terrible as a country at talking about family and how to support families and how to incentivise families to stay together and support each other over the longer term. Many European countries, Jo, are much better at talking about this than we are. I think this is a good discussion to have. We should talk about what tax incentives are available, and actually we should go further. I recently went through NCT, to give you an example, and I was struck. I went through this whole programme. At no point did they talk to me about how to actually be a father.
This is the National Childcare Trust.
They gave no guidance. And I think generally, across society, we need to actually think about, why do we have the highest rates of family breakdown in the developed world? Why is that happening here? And how can we encourage all families, right, irrespective of sexuality, etc.? How can we encourage them to stay together?
All right, Katie. Finally, is this seriously under discussion?
I wouldn't call it a policy priority from the Truss government, but I mean, there's a lot that's currently in the mix for growth. But I'm not hearing a strong steer on this one, though. I think on childcare, there is something Liz Truss has actually, ever since I think being a junior minister in the Department for Education, has been pushing for changes on childcare, and we can expect a swathe of attempts at least at reform there, but I'm not sure about this one.
Katie Balls, thank you very much for joining us. We're just going to show you some pictures, because last Thursday campaigners gathered outside the Scottish Parliament to protest against legislation that will make it easier for people to change their legally recognised gender. Now, supporters of the gender recognition reform Scotland bill say the current process takes too long and it's too invasive. Opponents say they're concerned about the potential impact on women's rights. Mari, what exactly is being proposed here?
Yeah, and thank you for framing the question that way, because I'm very proud that we're bringing forward this legislation. This is not about new rights for trans people. This is about simplifying the process which has existed for years, making that process less humiliating, less degrading, less distressing for the small number of people who would seek to legally change their gender. And this has engaged debate in Scotland. I would expect it to. We have a very highly engaged and politicised polity in Scotland, and I expect people to challenge all of what the Scottish Government do. But let's have that debate on the basis of information, nuance, respect, not diluting it down to sound bites and tweets. And we talked about kindness at the top of the programme. Let's approach this with kindness, because the people we're discussing here are already some of the most marginalised in our society. Absolutely.
And you said it's about simplification, but can you tell our viewers exactly what's being proposed in terms of concrete material changes?
Yes, it changes the period over which you would have to live in your new gender before being able to have that legally recognised. And I understand the bill as it stands is about demedicalising the process so that you don't have to have a diagnosis of gender dysmorphia. But it's still a legal statutory process where if there's any fraudulent behaviour attached to that, it would have criminal sanctions. But, you know, in all of this, I've thought really hard about it. And I think if you think back to great social movements of the past, albeit for women's rights, rights for the people of colour, the gay community, their rights have been hard won. It hasn't been easy, but they have invariably been worth pursuing, and I'm very proud that Scotland's pursuing this.
Matt, why are Scottish Conservatives not supporting it?
So I think this is an immensely fraught debate. I think, as you just heard, this is sort of the bill as it stands. I think the Scottish Conservatives, like all Conservatives, are looking very closely at what the details of this involve. But to be honest, what I'm trying to sort of shy away from is any kind of debate that turns this into a black and white issue, because these are immensely difficult challenges that need to be met with compassion and nothing else, I think.
But the changes are quite significant in a sense. They may be simplifying, as Mari says, but they are quite significant because instead of having to live full-time in your acquired gender for 2 years, it would reduce it to 3 months, and it would remove the 2 sets, I think, of documentation that at the moment are required. Could you see yourself getting behind that? Because, of course, the government under Boris Johnson dropped those changes, similar reforms to the gender recognition bill.
So I, if I'm honest, haven't made up my mind on lots of these issues.
Oh, OK, so you could be persuaded.
Well, and that is largely because they are issues where, even within the communities that are engaging directly with it, there is a huge amount of debate. I don't think anyone thinks that this stuff is settled, but I think we know where we are now is not quite right.
Right, what about Labour? Because the Labour Party in Scotland, under Anna Sarwar, is supporting the bill, but not the UK Labour Party.
Well, I think in Scotland we'll be looking at the bill. It's at the very start of its legislative process in Scotland, and the scrutiny is the right place for this to be.
I mean, the changes are very clear in terms of what would be required or not. It's also, I think, about reducing the age from 18 to 16 when you can self-declare, which is how it's been described. Should UK Labour take this on board?
I think we're going to look very closely at what has been proposed there. They've got a slightly different system in Scotland than we have in England, but I think fundamentally the principles, though, are good ones in the fact that it is not, I think, for a difficult debate around this to be pile on the hate. Let's take it out of the anger. Let's look at what we can do. But one thing that could be done in conjunction with this is making sure that trans and non-binary people are properly included in the ban on conversion therapy, because this is not the only issue. And if we are to make trans healthcare an issue, let's make availability of trans healthcare an issue. Let's make it so it's not only properly available in a small number of places in our country, but everywhere in our country, whether if you're a trans and have a diagnosis or have concerns, you're able to access appropriate healthcare. That's not the case at the moment.
But it has caused consternation for some people, particularly J.K. Rowling. She has been protesting against these changes. She said on a T-shirt, "I stand in solidarity for women in Scotland, all women protesting and speaking outside the Scottish Parliament. Nicola Sturgeon, destroyer of women's rights." How big an issue is this with the public?
It's becoming a big issue. That is one area where I think we are a little bit like America. We're a few miles behind, but on the same road. People do want to talk about this. And I do think it's very misleading, by the way, Jo, to say that women's rights, children's welfare are issues that are culture war issues. This is a tactic that's used in politics to shut down debates that people don't really want to have. Many women, J.K. Rowling and others, I think, my personal view, for understandable reasons, feel very concerned about what these changes will mean for women's rights and children's rights. Some of the changes there with this legislation, I believe, that you didn't mention, the age is also being lowered from 18 to 16. Now, I just think to myself, did I know myself when I was 16? Not particularly well. Would I have liked to have guidance from doctors and medical professionals? I think so. And just removing those bits has made a lot of people very nervous.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Mari too. And of course, as I say, we'll be back on air at 3 o'clock covering Nicola Sturgeon's speech. Thank you to all of my guests for joining me, and from all of us here, bye-bye.